Some truths arrive without warning, carried by the smallest messengers. On the western edge of Redemption Valley, where the prairie meets the foothills, a life can change with a knock at the door. This is the story of a man who built walls to keep the world away, until 3 words from a child's mouth brought those walls crashing down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October wind howled across the plains that evening, bending the tall grass and carrying the promise of the first winter frost. Jackson Harlow stood on the porch of his weathered ranch house, watching as the last light bled from the sky. His calloused hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, the only warmth he allowed himself these days. The Broken Anvil Ranch had been his sanctuary and his prison for the past 5 years. 2,000 acres of good grazing land, purchased with blood money. The insurance payout after the accident that took his wife and unborn child. The land was fertile, the cattle healthy, but Jackson remained as barren inside as the winter landscape soon would be. At 42, he had the weathered face of a man who had seen too much sun and not enough laughter, deep lines etched around eyes that rarely softened anymore. His neighbors in the nearby town of Redemption called him the Ghost Rider. Present but never quite there, moving through life like a man haunting his own existence. Jackson was about to retreat inside when he heard it, the faint rumble of an engine struggling up the long dirt road to his property. Visitors were rare at the Broken Anvil. He preferred it that way. The local ranchers had learned years ago that Jackson Harlow wasn't one for social calls or barn raisings or any of the communal activities that defined life in this remote corner of Wyoming. He set his coffee down, eyes narrowing as headlights cut through the gathering darkness. An old station wagon, its muffler dragging and engine coughing, limped toward his house like a wounded animal. Jackson's hand instinctively moved to his hip where his Colt .45 usually rested, but he was unarmed this evening. Still, his body tensed, ready for whatever trouble this unexpected visitor might bring. The car lurched to a stop in a cloud of dust and exhaust. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door creaked open and a woman emerged, her silhouette uncertain in the fading light. She was tall and slender, her movements hesitant as she surveyed the ranch house. Even from the porch, Jackson could feel her apprehension. "You're on private property," he called out, his voice rough from disuse. The woman startled, clearly not having spotted him in the shadows of the porch. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying on the wind. "I was looking for the Broken Anvil Ranch." "You found it," Jackson replied flatly. "Question is why." Before she could answer, the back door of the station wagon opened and a small figure tumbled out. A boy, no more than 7 or 8, with a mop of unruly dark hair. He raced toward the porch with the reckless abandon of youth, ignoring his mother's desperate call to come back. The boy stopped at the foot of the porch steps, looking up at Jackson with solemn eyes too old for his young face. In the dim light spilling from the house, Jackson could see the child was thin, his clothes worn but clean. There was something familiar about him that Jackson couldn't quite place. "Are you Mr. Harlow?" the boy asked, his voice clear and unwavering. Jackson nodded, unable to muster his usual gruffness in the face of this earnest child. "Mama said you'd take us in," the boy announced with the simple conviction of the very young. She promised. Jackson felt as though he'd been struck. He looked up sharply at the woman who now stood behind her son, her face a mask of anxiety and something else, desperation perhaps, or determination. In the spill of light from his open door, recognition dawned slowly. "Eleanor?" he whispered, the name feeling strange on his tongue after so many years. "Hello, Jackson," she replied softly. "It's been a long time." Eleanor Blackwood, his wife's younger sister, the wild one, the rebel, the girl who'd left Redemption Valley at 18 swearing never to return, the sister-in-law he'd barely known before tragedy, rewrote all their stories. "What are you doing here?" Jackson demanded, his momentary shock hardening back into suspicion. Eleanor's hand came to rest on her son's shoulder. "This is Henry," she said simply, as if that explained everything. The boy, Henry, continued to stare up at Jackson with an unnerving intensity. "Mama said you were family," he pressed on. "She said you'd help us because that's what family does." Jackson felt something twist inside him, some emotion he couldn't name breaking loose after years of careful burial. Family. He'd had no family since Rebecca died, had wanted none. "I don't know what your mama told you," he said finally, his voice deliberately cold. "But she's mistaken. I'm not taking anyone in." Henry's face fell, but only for a moment. "But Mama promised," he insisted. "She said you were good once, before the sadness got you." Jackson flinched as if the words were physical blows. He turned his gaze to Eleanor, who had the good grace to look ashamed. "We need a place to stay, Jackson," she said quietly. "Just for a little while. We've got nowhere else to go." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "That's not my problem," Jackson replied, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "There's a motel in town." "We can't afford it," Eleanor admitted, her pride clearly wounded by the confession. We're in trouble, Jackson. I wouldn't have come if there was anywhere else." The wind picked up, carrying the first icy kiss of winter. Jackson saw Henry shiver in his too-thin jacket, saw the exhaustion etched in Eleanor's face, noticed for the first time the fading bruise around her left eye that she'd tried to cover with makeup. Something stirred in the wasteland he'd made of his heart, an unwelcome spark of concern that he tried to extinguish before it could take hold. "Please," Henry said, his small voice somehow cutting through the howling wind. "Mama's real tired, and I promise I won't be any trouble." Jackson looked from the boy to his mother, then past them to the battered station wagon that had clearly seen better days. He thought of his empty house with its spare bedrooms that had never held the children he and Rebecca had planned. He thought of the loneliness that had become so familiar he no longer recognized it as pain. "One night," he said finally, the words feeling like surrender. "You can stay one night, then you need to figure something else out." Relief washed over Eleanor's face. "Thank you, Jackson." Don't," he cut her off. "This isn't a reunion. This is a bed for the night, nothing more." He turned and walked into the house without waiting to see if they followed. Behind him, he heard Henry's excited whisper, "I told you he'd help us, Mama," and felt a fresh stab of something that might have been guilt. Or perhaps it was simply indigestion. The inside of Jackson's house reflected the man himself, functional, austere, devoid of unnecessary comforts. The living room held a worn leather sofa, a recliner angled toward a television that rarely saw use, and bookshelves lined with volumes on ranching, local history, and the occasional Western novel. No photographs adorned the walls, no mementos cluttered the surfaces. It was a place to exist, not to live. Eleanor and Henry stepped inside tentatively, the boy's eyes wide as he took in his surroundings. "It's big," he whispered to his mother, who squeezed his shoulder in silent warning to be on his best behavior. "There's a guest room upstairs," Jackson said, not looking at either of them. "Bathroom's at the end of the hall. Kitchen's through there if you're hungry. Help yourselves to whatever you can find, but don't expect much." "We brought some food," Eleanor offered. "I could cook dinner for all of us." "As a thank you." Jackson shrugged, uncomfortable with the offer but too hungry to refuse. He couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked in his kitchen. "Suit yourself. I'll get your bags." Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of impending snow. Jackson approached the station wagon, noting the California license plates and the haphazard way belongings had been crammed into the back. This wasn't a planned visit. This was a flight. There wasn't much. 2 worn suitcases and a small backpack decorated with dinosaurs that clearly belonged to Henry. Jackson gathered them easily, years of hauling hay bales and calves, making the load seem light. As he turned back toward the house, something caught his eye, a crumpled photograph on the passenger seat, visible through the window. It was Eleanor, looking younger and happier, her arm around a man Jackson didn't recognize. They were smiling, the kind of carefree grins that suggested a time before whatever troubles had driven her back to Redemption Valley. Before the bruise on her face, Jackson turned away from the image, unsettled by the glimpse into a life he had no part in. Whatever Eleanor was running from, it wasn't his concern. One night, he reminded himself. Just one night, and then they'd be gone, taking their complications with them. When he returned to the house, Henry had already made himself at home, kneeling on a chair at the kitchen table. watching with fascination as his mother unpacked a few modest provisions from a paper bag. "We have pasta," Eleanor was saying, "and some sauce. It's not much, but it's fine." Jackson interrupted, setting the bags down in the doorway. "I'll be out checking on the horses. Make yourselves comfortable." He needed air, needed distance from the sudden invasion of his carefully constructed solitude. The child's presence especially disturbed him. So earnest, so hopeful, so painfully reminiscent of the future he'd lost. "Can I come see the horses?" Henry asked, perking up instantly. "I've never seen a real horse up close before." "Henry," Eleanor admonished gently. "Mr. Harlow probably wants some time alone." Jackson hesitated, torn between his desire for solitude and the naked longing on the boy's face. "It's dark," he said finally. "Not safe for a city kid. Maybe tomorrow." He regretted the words immediately. There wouldn't be a tomorrow. One night, he'd said. Just one. But Henry was already beaming, the promise of horses enough to light up his small face. "Thank you, Mr. Harlow. I'll get up real early, I promise." Jackson nodded awkwardly and retreated, feeling as though he'd somehow been outmaneuvered by a child. The night air welcomed him like an old friend, cool and uncomplicated. He made his way to the stables by memory more than sight, the path worn into his muscles after years of the same routine. Inside, the familiar smells of hay and horses greeted him. The stable housed 6 horses, 2 quarter horses for working the cattle, a retired thoroughbred he'd rescued from the track, and 3 Mustangs he'd adopted from the BLM when they were facing slaughter. Horses made sense to Jackson in a way people never had. They were honest in their needs and affections, uncomplicated in their judgments. "Got visitors," he told Midnight, his favorite gelding, as he checked the water trough. "Woman and a boy. Won't be staying long." The horse nickered softly, pushing his velvet nose against Jackson's shoulder as if to question this declaration. "Don't get attached," Jackson warned, though whether he was addressing the horse or himself wasn't entirely clear. "They're just passing through." By the time he'd finished his evening chores and returned to the house, the delicious aroma of tomato sauce and garlic had transformed his kitchen. Eleanor stood at the stove, stirring a pot with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to making do with little. Henry sat at the table, carefully folding paper napkins into triangles. "I'm setting the table," the boy announced proudly when Jackson entered. "Mama says it's important to have good manners when you're a guest." Jackson grunted noncommittally, thrown off balance by the domesticity of the scene. It had been so long since his kitchen had held anything but his solitary meals, hastily prepared and eaten without ceremony. "Dinner's almost ready," Eleanor said, not quite meeting his eyes. "I hope spaghetti is okay." It's Henry's favorite. "It's fine," Jackson replied, suddenly aware of the dirt under his fingernails and the hay clinging to his shirt. "I'll just wash up." In the bathroom, he splashed cold water on his face and stared at his reflection in the mirror. A stranger looked back at him, a man caught between the desire to maintain his isolation and the unexpected pull of human connection. He'd grown so accustomed to his solitude that even this small intrusion felt seismic. When he returned to the kitchen, Henry had poured water into mismatched glasses and was carefully placing them around the table. "Mr. Harlow, do you say grace before eating?" the boy asked seriously. Jackson couldn't remember the last time he'd said grace, couldn't remember the last time he'd felt grateful for anything. "Not usually," he admitted. "Oh," Henry looked disappointed. "We always do. Mama says it's important to be thankful, even when things are hard." Jackson glanced at Eleanor, who was serving the pasta with a flush of embarrassment on her cheeks. "You can say it if you want," Jackson offered awkwardly. Henry's face brightened. "Really? Okay." They sat, and Henry folded his small hands with practiced reverence. "Thank you for this food and for Mr. Harlow letting us stay in his house even though he doesn't know us very well. And thank you for helping us find family when we really needed it. And please let the horses like me tomorrow. Amen." "Amen," Eleanor echoed softly. Jackson remained silent, but something in the simple prayer, the boy's easy inclusion of him in his gratitude, stirred uncomfortable feelings he'd rather leave dormant. They ate, the silence broken only by Henry's occasional questions about ranch life and horses. which Jackson answered in terse sentences that gradually lengthened as the meal progressed. The boy's enthusiasm was oddly infectious, his curiosity boundless. "Do you have cows too? How many? Do they have names? Have you ever delivered a baby cow? Does it snow a lot here? Do you have a dog? I always wanted a dog, but our apartment wouldn't allow them." "Henry," Eleanor finally interrupted, "let Mr. Harlow eat in peace." "It's okay," Jackson found himself saying. "Yes to cows, about 300 head. No, they don't have names. Yes, I've delivered calves. Yes, it snows, starting any day now. And no, no dog. Coyotes got my last one." Henry's eyes widened. "Coyotes? Real ones? Are they dangerous?" "They can be," Jackson said, surprised to find himself enjoying the boy's reactions. "That's why you don't wander off the property, understand? Not safe for city kids." Henry nodded solemnly. "I promise. I'm really good at keeping promises, aren't I, Mama?" Something flickered across Eleanor's face. Pain, perhaps, or worry. "Yes, sweetheart. You are." After dinner, Eleanor insisted on washing the dishes despite Jackson's half-hearted protests. Henry yawned widely, the excitement of the day finally catching up with him. "Time for bed, buddy," Eleanor said, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Say goodnight to Mr. Harlow." Henry looked disappointed but didn't argue. "Good night, Mr. Harlow. Thank you for letting us stay, and for maybe showing me the horses tomorrow." Jackson nodded, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Good night, kid." Eleanor led her son upstairs, leaving Jackson alone with his thoughts and the unfamiliar sensation of a house that didn't feel quite so empty. He poured himself a finger of whiskey and took it to the porch, where the night sky stretched endlessly above him, stars sharp as diamonds in the clear mountain air. He wasn't sure how long he'd been sitting there when the screen door creaked open behind him. Eleanor stepped out, wrapping her cardigan tightly around herself against the chill. "Henry's asleep," she said softly. "He was so tired, poor thing. We've been on the road for 3 days." Jackson didn't respond, didn't ask the questions that hung between them. Where had they come from? What were they running from? Why here? Why him after all these years? Eleanor sighed, leaning against the porch railing. "You're wondering why I came." "Not my business," Jackson replied, though it was a lie. "It became your business when I showed up on your doorstep," she said. "You deserve an explanation." Jackson took another sip of whiskey, the burn in his throat matching the smoldering resentment he'd carried for years. "Rebecca's been gone 5 years. Not once did you call or write, not even for the funeral." Eleanor flinched. "I know, I wanted to, but—" "But what?" Jackson cut in, the whiskey loosening his carefully maintained control. "Too busy with your new life in California? Too happy to be bothered with your sister's death? I didn't know," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't know she died until almost a year later. David, my husband, he hid the letters, the phone messages. He cut me off from my family completely. By the time I found out, so much time had passed. I was ashamed and afraid." Jackson stared at her, processing this unexpected information. "Afraid of what?" Eleanor touched her face unconsciously, fingers ghosting over the fading bruise. "David has issues with control. When we first met, he was charming, protective. I mistook his possessiveness for love. By the time I realized the truth, I was already isolated, already afraid. And then there was Henry." She trailed off, looking out into the darkness that surrounded the ranch. "I tried to leave twice before. The first time, David found us at a women's shelter 2 states away. The second time, he broke my arm and promised the next time would be worse." Jackson's hand tightened around his glass. Violence against women was anathema to him, a betrayal of everything his father had taught him about what it meant to be a man. "What changed?" he asked finally. Eleanor's eyes, so like her sister's, met his directly. "He started getting rough with Henry. One night, I heard Henry crying, and when I went to his room, I knew we had to get out, no matter the cost. So I waited until David was on a business trip, emptied our emergency cash, and we ran." "And you came here," Jackson said flatly. "Why? Why not go to the police?" "David is the police," Eleanor replied, her voice hollow. "Deputy sheriff in our county. His friends are judges, lawyers. I tried reporting him once. They took his statement and let him take me home. That night was bad. Jackson felt sick. The familiar rage that had fueled him after Rebecca's death stirred again, finding a new target. I remembered this place, Eleanor continued. Rebecca used to write to me before David started intercepting the mail. She talked about the ranch you two bought, about your plans for the future. After I found out she'd died, I kept the address, just in case. In case what? Jackson asked, though he already knew the answer. In case we ever needed somewhere safe, Eleanor said simply. Somewhere he wouldn't think to look. Jackson drained his whiskey, the alcohol doing little to numb the storm of emotions her story had awakened. And the boy? Henry? He thinks I'm family? Eleanor hesitated. You're his uncle, Jackson. By marriage, at least. The only family we have left. For one night, Jackson reminded her, clinging to the boundaries he'd established. I said you could stay one night. Eleanor nodded, resignation settling over her features. I know. We'll be gone tomorrow. I just needed a moment to breathe. To think. To give Henry one night where he could sleep without being afraid. She turned to go back inside, then paused. She loved you so much, you know. Rebecca. In her letters, she talked about how you made her feel safe. How you were building a life together. I was jealous, if I'm honest. I thought I'd found that too with David. I was wrong. Jackson sat long after Eleanor had gone inside, the empty whiskey glass dangling from his fingers, her words echoing in his mind. Rebecca's letters, a life they'd planned together. Safety. All the things that had died with her on that icy road 5 years ago. Later, as he lay in his bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of others in his house, Jackson found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, wondering what Rebecca would want him to do. His wife had been the compass of their marriage, the one who always knew the right thing, the kind thing. She would know what to do about her sister and the boy who slept under his roof tonight. Just before dawn, Jackson rose, having barely slept. He moved quietly through the house, making coffee and stepping out onto the porch to watch the sun rise over the eastern mountains. The first light painted the valley in shades of gold and rose, illuminating the frost that had settled overnight, transforming ordinary grass into fields of diamonds. He heard the screen door open behind him and turned, expecting Eleanor. Instead, Henry stood there in Superman pajamas, his hair sticking up in all directions. "Morning, Mr. Harlow," the boy said, stifling a yawn. "I got up early for the horses, just like I promised." Despite himself, Jackson felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. "Your mama know you're up?" Henry shook his head. "She's real tired. I left her a note on my pillow so she won't worry." "Thoughtful," Jackson acknowledged. "You want some breakfast before we see the horses? Can't work on an empty stomach around here." Henry's face lit up at this unexpected acceptance. "Yes, please. Can I have coffee too? I'm almost 8. "Nice try, kid. Milk for you." In the kitchen, Jackson found himself making pancakes from a mix that had sat untouched in his cupboard for who knew how long. Henry perched on a chair, watching with fascination as Jackson moved around the kitchen. "My dad never cooked," the boy observed. "He said that was women's work." Jackson flipped a pancake with more force than necessary. "Your dad's wrong about a lot of things, sounds like." Henry nodded seriously. "That's what Mama says too. But not when he can hear her." They ate together in companionable silence, Henry demolishing 3 pancakes with the hearty appetite of childhood. Jackson found himself studying the boy's features, looking for traces of Rebecca and his nephew. The shape of his eyes, perhaps, or the determined set of his chin. "Can we see the horses now?" Henry asked, carefully carrying his plate to the sink just as his mother appeared in the doorway, her face creased with worry until she spotted her son. "Henry! You scared me." "I left a note," the boy protested. "Mr. Harlow made pancakes, and now we're going to see the horses." Eleanor looked at Jackson questioningly. He shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. Kid was up. Figured he might as well eat. "Thank you," she said softly, the simple words carrying the weight of far more than pancakes. Outside, the morning air was crisp and clean, the sky an impossible blue. Henry walked between them, occasionally skipping in excitement as they approached the stables. Jackson found himself watching the boy's reactions, taking unexpected pleasure in his wide-eyed wonder. The horses nickered in greeting as they entered the stable, warm breath creating puffs of vapor in the cool air. Henry stopped dead in his tracks, momentarily overcome. "They're so big," he whispered, pressing closer to his mother. "They won't hurt you," Jackson assured him, leading him to Daisy, the gentlest of his horses. "Here, hold your hand flat like this. Let her smell you first." With trembling fingers, Henry followed instructions. When Daisy's soft muzzle tickled his palm, he giggled, a pure, joyful sound that echoed in the stable. "She likes me!" he exclaimed, looking up at Jackson with such naked trust that it physically hurt. "Good judge of character, Daisy is," Jackson found himself saying. "Wouldn't let just anyone pet her." Eleanor watched from a few feet away, her expression a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "We should start packing up soon," she said quietly. "We've imposed enough." Jackson looked at her, at the dark circles under her eyes, at the tension she carried in her shoulders. He looked at Henry, now confidently stroking Daisy's neck, chattering away to the horse about life in California. Something shifted inside him, some wall that had stood firm for 5 years developing its first significant crack. "Where will you go?" he asked, keeping his voice low enough that Henry wouldn't hear. Eleanor shrugged, the gesture conveying a weariness that went bone deep. "East, maybe. As far from California as we can get. I have a little money saved. Enough for a few weeks in cheap motels while I look for work." "And if he finds you?" She didn't pretend to misunderstand. "He will, eventually. David doesn't give up what he considers his." Jackson watched Henry with Daisy, saw the gentleness in the boy's hands, the wonder in his face, saw too a shadow of fear that no child should have to carry. "Stay," he said, the word escaping before he could reconsider. Eleanor's head snapped up. "What?" Jackson cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the decision even as he made it. "Stay. Here. If what you told me is true about your husband, about what he did to you and the boy—" "It's true," Eleanor whispered. "Every word." Jackson nodded once, decision made. "Then stay. This place is remote. Hard to find unless you know where to look. Plenty of room. Henry seems to like the horses." Hope flickered across Eleanor's face, quickly followed by caution. "Jackson, I can't ask that of you. We're practically strangers." "Family," Jackson corrected gruffly, the word feeling foreign on his tongue. "That's what the boy said, isn't it? Mama said you'd take us in? Well, if she told the truth about her husband, about why you're running, then she can have the truth about this too. You can stay." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. "Why? After all this time, after I wasn't there when Rebecca died? Why would you help us?" Jackson looked away, uncomfortable with her emotion. "Because Rebecca would have wanted it," he said simply, "and because no child should have to be afraid in his own home." The truth was more complicated, of course. Jackson wasn't sure he could articulate all the reasons behind his decision. The loneliness he'd refused to acknowledge, the purpose he'd lost along with his wife, the unexpected connection he felt to this boy who had his mother's determined spirit. "Mr. Harlow!" Henry called, oblivious to the adults' conversation. "Daisy says she wants to go outside. Can I take her?" "Horses don't talk, kid," Jackson replied automatically. Henry rolled his eyes with the sublime confidence of childhood. "Not with words. But she's telling me anyway." Despite himself, Jackson smiled. A real smile, one that reached his eyes for the first time in longer than he could remember. "Tell you what. You help me with the morning chores, and then maybe we can take Daisy for a short ride. Would you like that?" Henry's face lit up, as if Jackson had offered him the world. "Really? A real ride? On a real horse?" "A real short ride," Jackson clarified. "And you'll wear a helmet." "Yes, sir," Henry agreed enthusiastically. "I'll be super careful, I promise." As the boy ran ahead to help fill water troughs, Eleanor touched Jackson's arm lightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what this means." Jackson nodded awkwardly, unused to gratitude or human touch. "It's just a horse ride." "You know that's not what I mean." He did know. The decision to let them stay was monumental. For all of them. It meant the end of his carefully constructed isolation. It meant responsibility. It meant risk. "One condition," he said firmly. "No more lies. I need to know everything. About your husband. About what kind of danger might follow you here. If I'm putting my neck out, I need to know what I'm facing." Eleanor nodded solemnly. "No more lies." "I promise." Ahead of them, Henry had climbed onto a hay bale and was surveying the stable like a king reviewing his domain. His face was alight with joy. The shadows of fear temporarily banished. "He's a good kid," Jackson said quietly. "The best," Eleanor agreed. "He deserves a chance at a normal life. A safe one." Jackson watched as Henry carefully measured feed under the supervision of Midnight, who seemed to be overseeing the boy's work with equine dignity. "Can't promise normal," Jackson said finally, "but safe. Safe I can do." As the morning sun streamed through the stable windows, turning dust motes into floating gold, Jackson Harlow felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 long years. The first tentative stirrings of hope. Not the expectation that everything would be easy or perfect, but the possibility that life might still hold meaning beyond mere existence. He didn't know what the future held, what challenges might come with harboring a woman and child on the run. He didn't know if he remembered how to be part of a family, how to open the closed rooms of his heart. But as Henry's laughter echoed through the stable, bright and clear as a bell on Sunday morning, Jackson knew one thing with certainty. He was ready to try. 2 weeks turned into a month, and autumn gave way to the first serious snowfall of the season. Jackson sat at his kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee while poring over cattle invoices, the soft sounds of life filling the once silent house. From the living room came Henry's excited chatter as he built a fortress of Lincoln logs on the rug before the fireplace. From upstairs, the gentle rhythm of Eleanor's footsteps as she sorted through a box of winter clothes Jackson had pulled from the attic. The domesticity of it all still startled him sometimes, like walking into a room and finding furniture rearranged. He would catch himself smiling at something Henry said, or find himself looking forward to dinner rather than merely enduring it as a biological necessity. These small shifts in his emotional landscape were unsettling but not entirely unwelcome. "Mr. Harlow," Henry called from the living room, "can you come see my fort? I made guard towers and everything." Jackson looked at the invoices he still needed to review and then at the hopeful face peering around the doorframe. The decision wasn't really a decision at all. "Let's see what you've got, kid," he said, pushing back from the table. Henry beamed, scampering back to his creation. The boy had an engineer's mind, Jackson had discovered, always building, always improvising. This latest construction was surprisingly complex, with walls that actually interlocked and a working drawbridge made from a ruler and string. "This here's the stables," Henry explained, pointing to one section. "And here's where the horses sleep. And this is the lookout tower, where we can see if bad guys are coming." Jackson crouched beside him, careful not to disturb the elaborate structure. "Pretty solid fortifications. What happens if the bad guys try to attack?" Henry's expression turned serious, the shadow that sometimes crossed his face appearing briefly. "We fight them off. You've got your rifle, and I'm learning to be brave." The simple declaration caught Jackson off guard. He'd known, of course, that Henry's father had left scars deeper than the fading bruise on Eleanor's face, but the child rarely spoke directly about his fears. "Being brave isn't about not being scared," Jackson said carefully. "It's about doing what needs doing even when you are scared." Henry considered this, his small face thoughtful. "Like when you have to go out in the blizzard to check on the cattle even though it's dangerous?" "Exactly like that." "Are you ever scared, Mr. Harlow?" Jackson hesitated, unaccustomed to such direct questions about his emotions. His instinct was to brush it off, to maintain the stoic persona he'd cultivated for years. But something in Henry's earnest expression demanded honesty. "Sometimes," he admitted, "when the spring floods nearly took out the east pasture fence, when lightning started that fire 3 years back, when your mama told me what your daddy did to you both." Henry nodded solemnly. "But you helped us anyway." "That's being brave." Before Jackson could respond, Eleanor appeared in the doorway, her arms full of winter clothes. "Henry, I found some sweaters that might fit you. They're a little old-fashioned, but they look warm." "They were Rebecca's brothers," Jackson explained, standing up. "They stayed with us one winter when their furnace went out. Never came back for their things." "We can't possibly take these," Eleanor protested, but Jackson waved her objection away. "Been sitting in boxes for years. Might as well get some use." Henry was already digging through the pile, pulling out a hand-knit sweater with a snowflake pattern. "Can I try this one, Mama? It looks like Christmas." Eleanor smiled, the expression transforming her face. In the weeks since their arrival, the constant tension in her features had gradually eased. She'd gained a little weight, the hollows in her cheeks filling out, and had taken to helping Jackson with the ranch's bookkeeping, revealing a head for figures he wouldn't have suspected. "Go ahead," she told Henry. "But first, clean up your fort. It's almost lunchtime. Can't we leave it up, please? Mr. Harlow doesn't mind, do you?" Jackson shrugged. "It's not in the way." Eleanor gave him a look that was becoming familiar. Part exasperation, part gratitude. "You're spoiling him, you know." "Nah," Jackson replied. "Just respecting a man's engineering project." Henry beamed at this adult recognition of his work and carefully placed a small plastic horse inside the fortress before running upstairs to try on the sweater. "You're good with him," Eleanor said softly when the boy was out of earshot. "Better than his own father ever was." Jackson shifted uncomfortably under the praise. "Not hard to clear that bar, sounds like." "Still, he talks about you constantly. Mr. Harlow showed me how to brush Daisy. Mr. Harlow says real cowboys always clean their plates. Mr. Harlow can build anything." Jackson felt his face warm. Kid's easily impressed. Eleanor shook her head. "He's a good judge of character, always has been. That's why David hated him so much. Henry saw through him from the beginning." The mention of David Blackwood sobered the moment. In the weeks since Eleanor and Henry had arrived, Jackson had learned more about the man they were running from. A decorated deputy sheriff with a spotless public record. A deacon in his church. A respected member of his community who, behind closed doors, terrorized his family with calculated cruelty. "Any word from the lawyer?" Jackson asked, lowering his voice. Eleanor shook her head. "Not yet. He says these things take time, especially with restraining orders across state lines. And since I technically took Henry without going through the courts—" "You did what you had to do," Jackson said firmly. "No court in its right mind would send that boy back to a man who hurt him." "Courts aren't always in their right minds when it comes to men with badges," Eleanor replied, a bitter edge to her voice, "especially when the mother has abandoned the family home and taken the child illegally across state lines." Jackson's jaw tightened. The more he learned about Eleanor's situation, the more his protective instincts flared, not just for Henry, but for her as well. She was so different from Rebecca. Where his wife had been soft-spoken and gentle, Eleanor was fierce and determined. But they shared the same core of strength, the same capacity for joy that even hardship couldn't quite extinguish. "We'll figure it out," he promised. "Meanwhile, you're safe here." Eleanor looked as though she wanted to say more, but Henry came thundering back down the stairs, proudly modeling the oversized sweater that hung past his knees. "Look, Mama, it's huge. I can grow into it for like 100 years. Eleanor laughed, the worry lines around her eyes momentarily erased. "At least 2 winters, I'd say. Now come help me make sandwiches." As they headed to the kitchen, Jackson returned to his invoices, but his mind kept wandering. The truth was, having Eleanor and Henry in the house had awakened something he'd thought long dead. Not just the stirrings of affection, but purpose. Their presence forced him to engage with the world again, to think beyond the next day's chores, or the next season's calving. It scared him, this reattachment to life, made him vulnerable in ways he'd spent 5 years avoiding. And yet, He couldn't bring himself to regret his decision to let them stay. After lunch, Jackson bundled up to check on the cattle in the north pasture. The snow was coming down steadily now, large flakes that promised significant accumulation by nightfall. "Can I come?" Henry asked, already pulling on his too large sweater. Jackson hesitated. It was cold out there, and the terrain could be treacherous in the snow. But the boy had proven himself surprisingly capable around the ranch, following instructions to the letter and showing uncommon sense for his age. "Bundle up proper," Jackson said finally. "Hat, gloves, boots, and you stay on the horse with me, understand? No wandering off." Henry nodded eagerly, running to gather his outdoor gear. Eleanor appeared from the laundry room, concern evident on her face. "It's pretty nasty out there, Jackson. Are you sure it's safe to take him?" "We'll stick to the main trails," Jackson assured her. "And the boy should learn how the ranch works in all seasons. Might be living here a while." Something softened in Eleanor's expression. "That's the first time you've said that. That we might be staying long term." Jackson hadn't realized it himself until the words left his mouth. "Well," he said gruffly, "winter's no time to be on the road anyway, and the boy's settling in, making friends at school." It was true. After much discussion, they'd enrolled Henry in the local elementary school under Eleanor's maiden name, with a carefully constructed story about visiting her brother-in-law after her husband's death. The small-town school had welcomed him warmly, and Henry had taken to education with the same enthusiasm he showed for everything else. "Thank you," Eleanor said simply. "For everything." Jackson nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude now as always. Better help the boy find his warmest socks. His feet get cold easy. Soon Jackson and Henry were mounted on Midnight, the big gelding steady beneath them as they picked their way through the snowy landscape. Henry sat in front of Jackson, encircled by his arms as he held the reins, chattering excitedly about school and his new friend Michael, and the science project they were planning about volcanic eruptions. "Michael says we can make real lava with baking soda and vinegar. Is that true, Mr. Harlow? Can we try it?" "Sounds messy," Jackson observed. "But I suppose we could set it up in the barn where spills don't matter so much." Henry twisted to look up at him, snowflakes catching on his eyelashes. "Really? You'll help us?" "Sure," Jackson said. "Your mama too, if she wants. She's good at that science stuff." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the snow muffling all sound except the crunch of Midnight's hooves and the occasional low of cattle as they approached the herd. Jackson had been teaching Henry about ranching, and the boy absorbed the lessons eagerly, asking intelligent questions and remembering details that surprised even Jackson. "The cattle bunched together in the snow," Henry observed. "Is that to stay warm?" "Smart observation," Jackson said, feeling an unexpected surge of pride. "They do, sharing body heat. Humans do it too, in survival situations. Like when me and Mama sleep in the same bed when the heater breaks?" Exactly like that. As they checked on the herd, making sure all were accounted for and had access to the hay Jackson had put out earlier, Henry continued his stream of observations and questions. The boy had a keen eye and a curious mind, qualities Jackson had always respected. "What's that?" Henry suddenly asked, pointing toward the tree line at the edge of the property. Jackson squinted through the falling snow. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then a flash of movement. Something or someone moving among the pines. "Probably a deer," he said, but instinct made him reach for the rifle in its saddle holster. "Or maybe a coyote." But even as he spoke, he knew it was neither. The movement was too deliberate, too vertical. A person, watching them from the trees. "Let's head back," Jackson said, trying to keep his voice casual. "Snow's picking up. Your mama will worry." He turned Midnight toward home, but not before catching another glimpse of the figure. Definitely human, definitely trying to stay hidden. A cold that had nothing to do with the weather settled in Jackson's gut. When they returned to the ranch house, Jackson made sure Henry was safely inside before checking the perimeter of the property. He found footprints near the tree line where they'd seen the figure, already filling with fresh snow but no other sign of intrusion. Still, he double-checked all the doors and windows that night and kept his rifle closer than usual. He said nothing to Eleanor, not wanting to alarm her unnecessarily. It could have been a hunter who strayed too close to his property line, could have been one of the teenagers from town on a dare. Could have been any number of innocent explanations. But as he lay in bed that night, listening to the wind howl around the eaves, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful interlude was coming to an end. The next morning dawned clear and brilliant, the storm having moved on during the night, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Every surface glittered with fresh snow, and the sky was the particular shade of blue that only appears after a winter storm. Henry was up early, eager to play in the snow. Jackson watched from the porch as the boy built a lopsided snowman, his red hat a bright spot against the white expanse of the yard. Eleanor joined him, coffee mug in hand. "He's never seen snow like this," she said, smiling as Henry flopped backward to make a snow angel. "We lived in Southern California. He thinks this is magical." "It is, kind of," Jackson admitted. "First heavy snow of the season always feels like the world's been made new." Eleanor studied him over the rim of her mug. "You sound almost poetic, Jackson Harlow." "Who'd have thought?" he snorted, embarrassed. "Don't get used to it." Their easy banter was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching. Jackson tensed immediately, hand going to the small of his back where his pistol was holstered. But as the vehicle came into view, he relaxed slightly. "Sheriff Mills," he explained to Eleanor, who had gone pale. "Local, not California. Probably just checking on isolated properties after the storm." Still, he moved protectively in front of her as the sheriff's SUV pulled up to the house. "Morning, Harlow," Sheriff Mills called, climbing out of his vehicle. He was a big man with a gray mustache and kind eyes that missed nothing. "Quite a storm we had." "Morning, Sheriff," Jackson replied. "Roads clear already?" "County's good about plowing. Got all the main routes open by dawn." The sheriff's eyes drifted to Eleanor, then to Henry, who had abandoned his snowman to hide partially behind his mother. "Don't believe I've had the pleasure." Jackson hesitated only briefly. "This is Eleanor Bennett, my sister-in-law, and her boy, Henry. They're staying with me for a while." If the sheriff was surprised to discover that the notoriously solitary Jackson Harlow had houseguests, he hit it well. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat to Eleanor. "Young man, welcome to Redemption Valley." "Thank you, Sheriff," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the tension Jackson could feel radiating from her. "It's a beautiful area." "That it is," Mills agreed. Then, to Jackson, "Mind if we talk privately for a minute? Official business." Jackson nodded. "Eleanor, why don't you and Henry go in and warm up? I'll be right along." She looked as though she wanted to object, but nodded and guided Henry inside. The boy went reluctantly, casting worried glances over his shoulder at Jackson. When they were alone, Sheriff Mills's expression grew serious. "Didn't know you had family staying, Harlow. Didn't realize I needed to file a report about my houseguests, Sheriff." Mills shook his head. "You don't, but it might have been relevant to what I'm about to tell you. We had a stranger in town yesterday asking questions. About you, specifically." Jackson felt his muscles tense. "What kind of questions?" "Whether you lived alone, how far out your property was, if you had any visitors recently." Mills studied Jackson's face. "Showed particular interest when Mabel at the diner mentioned you'd been in with a woman and a boy, buying ice cream after school last week." Jackson silently cursed small-town gossip. He'd taken Henry for a treat after picking him up from school, and Eleanor had joined them. It had been a pleasant afternoon, one of many simple moments that had begun to fill the empty spaces in his life. "Who was this stranger?" Jackson asked, though he already knew the answer. "Didn't give a name. Drove a California plate, SUV though. Dark blue Ford Explorer." Mills cocked his head. "Any reason a man from California would be looking for you, Harlow? Or maybe for your sister-in-law?" Jackson weighed his options. Sheriff Mills was a good man, fair and honest. But he was also a law enforcement officer, bound by certain protocols. "Eleanor's in a difficult situation," Jackson said carefully. "Left a bad marriage, needed a safe place for her and the boy." Mills nodded slowly. "Thought it might be something like that. The man had a badge, Harlow. Didn't flash it officially, but Mabel saw it when he opened his wallet. Said he was a sheriff's deputy, just passing through. Jackson's blood ran cold. David Blackwood had found them. "Appreciate the heads up, Sheriff," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "Harlow," Mills said, his voice dropping, "if your sister-in-law is in trouble with the law, there are proper channels. I'd rather hear it from you than have some out-of-state situation blow up in my jurisdiction." Jackson looked at the house, thinking of Eleanor and Henry inside, of the life they were building here, of the peace they'd found after so much fear. "She's not a criminal," Jackson said firmly. "She's protecting her son from an abusive father. A father who happens to wear a badge, which made it damn near impossible for her to get help through proper channels." Mills's expression was unreadable. "That's a serious accusation." "It's the truth." Jackson met the sheriff's gaze steadily. "You've got kids, don't you, Mills? 2 daughters, grown now. Then you tell me, what would you do if one of them was being hurt by her husband? If your grandchild was in danger? Would you wait for the system to work, knowing it was stacked against her?" A muscle in Mills's jaw twitched. "I'd want to kill the bastard," he admitted. "Well, Eleanor's a better person than either of us. She just wants to keep her boy safe." Sheriff Mills sighed heavily, looking out over the snow-covered landscape. "This deputy, he's got no jurisdiction here. But if there's a custody issue, if he's got court papers, he's got nothing but a history of violence and the protection of a corrupt department," Jackson said. "Eleanor is working with a lawyer, doing everything by the book, now that she and Henry are safe." Mills nodded slowly. "I'll keep an eye out for our California visitor. Let you know if he shows up again. But Harlow, you might want to consider security measures, just in case." "Already on it." After the sheriff left, Jackson went inside to find Eleanor sitting at the kitchen table, her face ashen. Henry was nowhere to be seen. "I sent him upstairs to change his wet clothes," she explained, before Jackson could ask. "I didn't want him to hear. It's David, isn't it? He's found us." Jackson nodded grimly. "Asking questions in town." "Sheriff Mills came to warn me." Eleanor's hands trembled as she covered her face. "I knew this would happen. I knew he'd find us eventually. I shouldn't have brought this to your door, Jackson. I shouldn't have involved you." Jackson sat across from her, gently pulling her hands away from her face. "Listen to me. You did exactly right coming here. This is your home now, yours and Henry's, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take you away against your will." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes. "You don't know David. He won't stop. He'll use the law, his badge, whatever it takes. He sees us as his property, not as people." "Then we'll be ready," Jackson said firmly. "Sheriff Mills is on our side, I think. And this is my land. Anyone comes here uninvited, badge or no badge, they'll find more trouble than they bargained for." Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "You've changed," she said softly. Jackson shifted uncomfortably. "Not really." "Yes, you have. The man who met us at the door that first night would never have spoken like this. Would never have put himself at risk for us." Before Jackson could respond, Henry appeared in the doorway, his hair damp from melted snow. "Is everything okay? Did that policeman come to take us away?" Eleanor opened her arms and Henry ran into them. "No, sweetheart. Sheriff Mills is a friend. He just came to check on everyone after the storm." Henry looked at Jackson for confirmation. "Really? He's not like Daddy." "Really," Jackson assured him. "But listen, Henry. We need to be extra careful for a while. No wandering off, even on the ranch. You stay where either your mama or I can see you, understand?" Henry nodded solemnly. "Is Daddy looking for us?" Eleanor and Jackson exchanged glances. They had agreed early on not to lie to the boy. He had been through too much already, had seen too much of the adult world's cruelty to be sheltered now. "We think he might be," Eleanor said gently, "but you don't need to worry. Mr. Harlow and I will keep you safe. "I know," Henry said with the simple faith of childhood. "Mr. Harlow won't let anybody hurt us. And I'm getting braver every day." Jackson felt something twist in his chest. Pride and fear and fierce protectiveness all mingled together. In just a few short weeks, this child had worked his way into Jackson's heart more thoroughly than he would have believed possible. "That's right," he said, ruffling Henry's hair. "We're going to be just fine." But that night, after Eleanor and Henry had gone to bed, Jackson sat in the darkness of his living room, rifle across his knees, watching the moonlight on the snow outside. He was not a man given to prayer, had lost his faith along with his wife and unborn child. But as he kept his vigil, he found himself asking whatever power might exist in the universe to help him keep his promise to Henry. Because the truth was, David Blackwood was coming, and when he did, Jackson would be standing between him and the family that had, against all odds, become his own. The next few days passed in a state of heightened vigilance. Jackson installed new locks on all the doors and windows. He kept the rifle handy and made sure Eleanor knew how to use it. He drove Henry to and from school himself, watching for unfamiliar vehicles. Sheriff Mills increased patrols past the ranch and stationed a deputy near the school during pickup and drop-off times. Through it all, they tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for Henry's sake. They still had meals together, still helped with homework, still tended to the animals. But underneath the routines ran a current of tension, an awareness that their peaceful existence hung by a thread. "You should leave," Jackson told Eleanor late one night as they sat at the kitchen table after Henry had gone to bed. "Both of you, go somewhere he wouldn't think to look. I can give you money, help you get settled." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "Running didn't work. He found us anyway. At least here, we have a home, friends, support. Henry is thriving for the first time in years. I won't take that from him unless I absolutely have to." Jackson wanted to argue, wanted to make her understand the danger. But the truth was, he couldn't bear the thought of them leaving either. The house would be unbearably empty without Henry's laughter, without Eleanor's quiet strength. "Then we stand our ground," he said finally. "Together." Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand, a gesture so unexpected that Jackson nearly pulled away. But he didn't. Instead, he turned his palm upward, letting their fingers intertwine. "Together," she agreed softly. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Jackson found himself looking at Eleanor's face, really looking at the curve of her cheek, the determination in her eyes, the stray lock of hair that had escaped her ponytail. She was beautiful in a way he hadn't allowed himself to notice before. The realization should have alarmed him. She was Rebecca's sister, was under his protection, was vulnerable. Any feelings beyond familial concern were inappropriate at best, dangerous at worst. And yet, as Eleanor's thumb traced a small circle on the back of his hand, Jackson felt something long dormant stir to life. "I should check the locks," he said abruptly, standing up and breaking the connection. Eleanor watched him go, her expression unreadable. "Good night, Jackson," she said softly. "Night," he replied, not trusting himself to say more. Later, lying in his bed listening to the wind, Jackson confronted the truth he'd been avoiding. He was falling for Eleanor. Had been falling since that first night when she stood in his driveway with her chin raised defiantly despite her fear. It was impossible, of course. Complicated beyond measure. And yet, there it was. The realization kept him awake long into the night, wrestling with guilt and longing and the ghost of his wife. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were a confused tangle of past and present. Rebecca's laugh, Eleanor's eyes, Henry's small hand in his, the sound of approaching footsteps, the shadow of danger. He woke before dawn, unsettled and on edge. Something didn't feel right. The house was quiet, too quiet, missing the small sounds of other people breathing, moving, living. Jackson reached for his gun and moved silently into the hallway. Henry's door was ajar. Jackson pushed it open to find the bed empty, covers thrown back. His heart rate spiked as he moved quickly to Eleanor's room, only to find it empty as well. Fighting down panic, he checked the bathroom, the kitchen, the living room. Nothing. Then he noticed the back door, unlocked and slightly open, a dusting of snow on the floor where it had blown in. Outside, the world was still dark, the eastern sky just beginning to lighten. Jackson scanned the yard, looking for footprints. for any sign of where they might have gone. His eye caught movement near the stables, and relief flooded through him as he recognized Eleanor's slight figure. He was halfway across the yard when he realized she wasn't alone. A man stood with her, tall, broad-shouldered, his stance aggressive even, from a distance. And in his arms, struggling against his grip, was Henry. David Blackwood had come for his family. Jackson froze, every instinct screaming at him to charge forward, to protect what was his. But years of working with unpredictable animals had taught him when to move slowly. One wrong step now could put Eleanor and Henry in greater danger. "Let him go," Eleanor was saying, her voice carrying on the still morning air. "David, please. He's scared." "He's my son," David Blackwood replied, his voice colder than the winter air. "My son that you stole from me." In the growing light, Jackson could see David more clearly now, a handsome man in his early 40s, with the muscular build of someone who spent time at the gym rather than doing honest work. He wore civilian clothes, but his stance betrayed his law enforcement training. "Daddy, you're hurting me," Henry whimpered, still struggling against the arm locked around his small chest. "Stop squirming then," David snapped. "This is all your mother's fault. If she hadn't filled your head with lies about me, we wouldn't be in this situation." Jackson took another careful step forward, making sure to stay in the shadows. His rifle was back in the house, but he had his pistol tucked into his waistband. Not that he wanted to use it with Henry so close, but its weight was reassuring. "How did you find us?" Eleanor asked, clearly trying to keep David talking while she figured out what to do. David laughed, an ugly sound. "You think I can't track my own wife?" Credit card at a gas station in Utah. "A witness who remembered a woman and boy matching your description asking for directions to Wyoming. And then, when I got to this pathetic excuse for a town, everyone was talking about the reclusive rancher who suddenly had a pretty sister-in-law and a nephew staying with him." His gaze swept the property with contempt. "This is what you left me for? This rundown ranch in the middle of nowhere? With him?" Jackson chose that moment to step into the light. "Let the boy go, Blackwood." David's head whipped around, his expression darkening when he saw Jackson. "So the hermit finally appears. You must be Harlow, the grieving widower who decided to move in on his dead wife's sister." Jackson ignored the bait, keeping his voice level. "This doesn't have to get ugly. Just let Henry go, and we can talk this through like reasonable men." "Reasonable?" David spat the word. "There's nothing reasonable about a man who helps a woman kidnap her own child, who harbors them illegally, who interferes in a family matter that's none of his business." Jackson took another step closer, noting how David's grip on Henry tightened. "The boy's scared? Whatever issues you and Eleanor have, Henry shouldn't be in the middle of them." "Don't tell me how to handle my son," David snarled. But something in Jackson's calm demeanor seemed to unsettle him. He glanced around, perhaps only now realizing how isolated they were. "Where's your phone, Eleanor? We're calling this in. Kidnapping charges, custodial interference, crossing state lines with a minor." "Nobody's calling anything in," Jackson said, continuing his slow approach. "Not until the boy is safely away from this situation." David's free hand moved toward his hip, where Jackson suspected he had a concealed weapon. "Back off, Harlow. I'm still a law enforcement officer, and you're interfering with police business." "You're not an officer here," Jackson replied steadily. "You have no jurisdiction, no authority. Right now, you're just a man trespassing on my property, frightening a child." Out of the corner of his eye, Jackson could see Eleanor edging closer to David, her focus entirely on Henry. Her face was pale but determined, a mother ready to do whatever necessary to protect her son. "Henry," Jackson said, keeping his eyes on David, "remember what we talked about? About being brave even when you're scared?" Henry nodded, his small face streaked with tears but his eyes alert, watching Jackson carefully. "I need you to be brave right now," Jackson continued. "When I say the word, I want you to think about what Daisy does when there's a snake in the paddock." Henry's eyes widened slightly in understanding. They had seen it just last week, the gentle mare's surprising defense mechanism when confronted with a rattlesnake. She had reared up suddenly, forelegs pawing the air, creating enough commotion and distraction for Jackson to dispatch the snake. David looked between them, confused by the apparent non sequitur. "What are you talking about? What snake?" "Daisy," Jackson said clearly. In that instant, Henry threw his head back hard, connecting with David's chin. Simultaneously, he stomped down on his father's instep with all his might. The combination was enough to make David's grip loosen just slightly, but it was all the opening Eleanor needed. She lunged forward, grabbing Henry's arm and yanking him free while David was momentarily off balance. "Run!" she shouted, pushing Henry toward the house. David recovered quickly, rage contorting his features as he reached for Eleanor. "You bitch!" But Jackson was already there, driving his shoulder into David's midsection and taking them both to the ground. They rolled in the snow, each fighting for advantage. David was younger, trained in police combat techniques. But Jackson had the strength born of years of hard physical labor, and tonight, he had something worth fighting for. David landed a solid punch to Jackson's jaw, momentarily stunning him. As Jackson's grip loosened, David scrambled to his feet, reaching for something at his back. A gun, Jackson realized with a surge of adrenaline. Before David could clear the weapon from his waistband, Jackson tackled him again, this time focusing on controlling the gun hand. They crashed against the stable door, the impact sending them both to their knees. The gun skittered across the packed snow, landing several feet away. David drove an elbow into Jackson's ribs, the pain sharp and immediate. But Jackson held on, wrestling the larger man into a headlock. "It's over, Blackwood," he grunted. "They're not going with you." "They're mine," David snarled, still struggling. "My family. Who do you think you are?" "Someone who knows the difference between loving people and owning them," Jackson replied, tightening his hold. David's struggles grew more desperate. With a sudden surge of strength, he broke free of Jackson's grip and lunged for his gun. Jackson tackled him again, but this time David was ready. He rolled with the impact, coming up on top, his hands finding Jackson's throat. "I could kill you right now," David hissed, his fingers tightening. "Say you attacked an officer." "Self-defense." No one would question it. Jackson fought to breathe, to break the grip cutting off his air. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. Through the roaring in his ears, he heard a familiar voice. "Let him go, David." Eleanor stood a few yards away, Jackson's rifle in her hands, aimed steadily at her husband. David laughed, though his hands loosened slightly on Jackson's throat. "You won't shoot me, Ellie. You don't have it in you." "You're right," she agreed, her voice remarkably calm. "I don't want to shoot you. I don't want Henry to have that memory of his father. But if you don't take your hands off Jackson right now, I'll put a bullet through your shoulder. I won't kill you, but you'll never raise your arm to hit anyone again." Something in her tone, the absolute certainty, the cold determination, made David hesitate. His gaze flicked between the rifle and Eleanor's face. "You've changed," he said, sounding almost surprised. "Yes," she agreed simply. "I have. Now let him go and step back." Slowly. David released his grip on Jackson's throat and rose carefully to his feet, hands slightly raised. Jackson rolled away, coughing and gasping for air. "Sheriff Mills is on his way," Eleanor continued, the rifle never wavering. "One of the ranch hands saw your car and called him. It's over, David." As if summoned by her words, the wail of a siren became audible in the distance. David's expression darkened as he realized he was running out of options. "This isn't over," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "You think some small-town sheriff is going to arrest one of their own? Think again, Ellie. I've got friends in departments across 3 states. I've got custody papers signed by a judge. You're the one who's going to jail, not me." "We'll see about that," Eleanor replied. "But right now, you're going to back up toward the gate and wait for Sheriff Mills to arrive. Any sudden moves, and I keep my promise about that shoulder." David took a step back, then another, clearly calculating his odds. The sirens were getting closer. Jackson had recovered enough to get to his feet, positioning himself beside Eleanor. "You two deserve each other," David said bitterly. "The grieving widower and the runaway wife. How touching. But Henry is my son, my blood, and I will get him back." "He stopped being yours the moment you raised your hand to him," Eleanor said, a tremor finally entering her voice. "A real father protects his child, loves him for who he is, not what he can be molded into. A real father builds his child up instead of breaking him down." You've never been a real father to Henry." David's face contorted with rage. For a moment, Jackson thought he might charge them, rifle or no rifle. But the sound of tires on gravel announced Sheriff Mills's arrival. David's expression smoothed into something more controlled, more calculating. "This isn't over," he repeated, then turned and walked calmly toward the approaching sheriff's vehicle, his hands now raised in a show of compliance. Jackson turned to Eleanor, gently lowering the rifle barrel toward the ground. "You okay?" She nodded, though her hands were shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. "Henry?" "Safe in the house. I told him to lock himself in the bathroom and not come out until one of us came for him." She handed Jackson the rifle, suddenly looking exhausted. "I've never pointed a gun at anyone before." "You did good," Jackson said, fighting the urge to pull her into his arms. "Real good." They watched as Sheriff Mills stepped out of his vehicle, hand on his holstered weapon as David approached him. The two men spoke, David gesturing animatedly while Mills listened with a stone face. "He's telling his side first," Eleanor said, worry creeping into her voice. "Spinning it to make me look like the criminal." "Mills is smarter than that," Jackson assured her, though he shared her concern. "He knows there's more to the story." The sheriff nodded to David, then motioned for him to wait by the vehicle. Mills walked toward Jackson and Eleanor, his expression grave. "Morning, Harlow," he said, nodding to Jackson before turning to Eleanor. "Ma'am, I understand there's been some trouble here." "Sheriff, that man is David Blackwood," Eleanor began, the words tumbling out. "My husband. He was trying to take Henry by force. He had a gun." Mills held up a hand. "Slow down, Mrs. Blackwood. I'm going to sort this out, but I need to understand exactly what happened here." "He trespassed on my property before dawn," Jackson said. "Tried to take the boy against his will. Assaulted both of us. His weapon is over there." He pointed to where David's gun still lay in the snow. Mills looked between them, then back at David, who was watching the exchange with calculated calm. "He says you've been harboring his wife and son illegally. Says there's a custody order in California giving him full parental rights. Says you attacked him when he tried to retrieve his child." "That's not true," Eleanor protested. "There was no custody hearing. I left because he was abusing both of us. Henry has the bruises to prove it." "I'm not taking sides here," Mills said, though his expression softened slightly. "Just telling you what I'm dealing with. This is a complicated situation with a fellow officer involved." "Fellow officer or not, he broke the law," Jackson insisted. "Trespassing, assault, attempting to abduct a child." Mills sighed heavily. "Look, I've got to follow procedure here. Mr. Blackwood does have documentation, custody papers that appear legitimate on their face. I can't just ignore that, even if I have my doubts about his story." Eleanor went pale. "You can't let him take Henry." "I'm not planning to," Mills assured her. "Not today, anyway. But we need to get this sorted out legally, through the proper channels. Right now, I'm going to take Mr. Blackwood into town for questioning about the alleged trespassing and assault. Meanwhile, I strongly suggest you call your lawyer, Mrs. Blackwood. Today." Relief flooded Eleanor's face. "Thank you, Sheriff." Mills lowered his voice. "Don't thank me yet. I can hold him for 24 hours, maybe 48 if I push it. But without charges that'll stick, I'll have to release him. And those custody papers look real, even if they were obtained under questionable circumstances." Jackson felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you've got a narrow window to get this figured out legally," Mills replied grimly. "If there's evidence of abuse, we need it documented. Medical records, photographs, witness statements. Anything that would convince a judge to issue an emergency protective order." Eleanor nodded, her expression determined despite her fear. "I understand. I'll call the lawyer right away." Mills looked between them, something like compassion in his weathered face. "For what it's worth, I believe you. But belief isn't enough in court. You need evidence, and you need it fast." As the sheriff walked back to his vehicle, David turned to look at them one last time. Even from a distance, the malice in his gaze was unmistakable. This was a man who wouldn't give up, wouldn't back down. A man who saw people as possessions to be controlled, rather than hearts to be cherished. "He's going to come back," Eleanor whispered as Mills drove away with David in the back seat. "As soon as they release him." Jackson nodded grimly. "I know, but we'll be ready." They found Henry exactly where Eleanor had told him to wait, curled in the bathtub with a towel wrapped around him for comfort. When he saw them, he launched himself into his mother's arms, sobbing with relief. "I was so scared," he cried. "Daddy was so mad, he said we had to go with him right now, that you were a bad person for taking me away. He grabbed my arm really hard." Eleanor held him close, her own tears falling into his hair. "I know, baby, I'm so sorry, but you were so brave, just like Mr. Harlow taught you." Henry looked up at Jackson, his small face streaked with tears but alight with something like pride. "I did the daisy trick, just like we practiced." Jackson crouched down to the boy's level, gently ruffling his hair. "You sure did, partner. That was some quick thinking. You're one tough cowboy." "Is Daddy gone now?" Henry asked, his voice small. Eleanor and Jackson exchanged glances. "For now," Eleanor said carefully. "Sheriff Mills took him to town. But we need to talk, Henry, about what happens next." The next few hours were a flurry of activity. Eleanor spent most of the morning on the phone with her lawyer, describing the morning's events and discussing legal strategies. Jackson called his own attorney, an old friend who specialized in family law, seeking a second opinion. Henry stayed close to both of them, his usual exuberance dimmed by the morning's trauma. By afternoon, a plan was taking shape. Eleanor's lawyer would file for an emergency protective order based on the morning's events and the documented history of abuse. Jackson's attorney would challenge the California custody order on jurisdictional grounds, arguing that Henry had established residency in Wyoming. Sheriff Mills had agreed to provide a statement about David's behavior and the circumstances of his arrest. "It's not perfect," Eleanor admitted as they sat at the kitchen table, a pot of coffee growing cold between them. "The legal process takes time, and David knows how to work the system. He's been doing it for years. We just need to hold him off long enough to get the protective order in place," Jackson said. "Once that happens, he can't legally come near either of you." "A piece of paper won't stop him," Eleanor said, voicing the fear they both shared. "If he's willing to drive across 3 states and break into a stranger's property, a court order won't make much difference." She was right, and Jackson knew it. David Blackwood had demonstrated that he would go to any lengths to regain control of his family. A man like that didn't simply give up and go home. "Then we make sure he can't get to you," Jackson said firmly. "I've got friends who can help. Retired rangers, other ranchers. We'll set up a schedule, make sure someone's always here until this is resolved." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "I've brought nothing but trouble to your door, Jackson. This isn't your fight." "It became my fight the moment you and Henry walked into my life," Jackson replied, surprising himself with the simple truth of it. "I was half dead before you arrived, Eleanor. Just going through the motions. And then this kid shows up saying his mama told him I'd take them in, and suddenly I had something to live for again." Eleanor's eyes widened at his admission. "Jackson." "I'm not saying it right," he continued awkwardly. "I'm not good with words. But you and Henry, you're family now, and family stands together." Before Eleanor could respond, the phone rang. Jackson answered it, his expression growing serious as he listened to the caller. "When?" he asked, his knuckles whitening around the receiver. "All right, thanks for the heads up." He hung up and turned to Eleanor, his face grim. "That was Mills. They're releasing David. The district attorney declined to file charges without more evidence than just our statements." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, absorbing this new blow. "So he's free to come after us again?" "Not exactly," Jackson said. "Mills made it clear that if David shows up here again, he'll be arrested for trespassing immediately. And he's having a deputy drive by regularly to check on us." "Small comfort," Eleanor murmured. Then, with a visible effort, she straightened her shoulders. "We need to get Henry somewhere safer. Maybe a hotel in town or—" "No," Jackson said firmly. "Splitting up is exactly what he wants. Together, we're stronger. We've got good security here, people watching our backs, and legal proceedings underway. Running now would just make you look unstable to the courts. Eleanor considered his words, then nodded slowly. Further attempts to approach the property, but his presence in town was a constant threat. He had taken a room at the local motel, telling anyone who would listen that he was a law enforcement officer trying to recover his kidnapped son from an unstable mother and her violent boyfriend. Some believed him. Others, knowing Jackson's character, were more skeptical. The legal proceedings moved slowly, frustratingly so. Eleanor's lawyer filed the emergency protective order, but the hearing was scheduled for the following week. Jackson's attorney challenged the California custody order, but jurisdictional questions complicated matters. Every day was a holding pattern, waiting for either legal resolution or another confrontation. Through it all, Henry showed a resilience that amazed both adults. He had nightmares, yes, and moments of fear and anxiety, but he also had periods of pure childhood joy, playing in the snow, helping with the animals, building elaborate structures from the Lincoln logs that had become his favorite toy. Kids are tougher than we give them credit for. Jackson observed one evening as they watched Henry reading to himself on the couch, completely absorbed in a book about wild horses. As long as they know they're loved, they can weather almost anything. Eleanor nodded, her eyes soft as she watched her son. He's the reason I finally found the courage to leave. Not for myself. I might have endured it forever if it was just me. But I couldn't bear to see David crushing Henry's spirit day by day. You're both pretty damn courageous if you ask me, Jackson said. Takes guts to leave everything behind, to start over with nothing but hope and a tank of gas. We had more than that, Eleanor corrected him gently. We had a destination. A person who might help us, even if it was a long shot. Jackson felt warmth spread through him at her words. The idea that she had thought of him, had trusted him sight unseen based solely on her sister's letters, was humbling. Still, he said, you took one hell of a risk. Best risk I ever took, Eleanor replied simply. As they smiled at each other across the kitchen table, the telephone rang, shattering the moment. Jackson answered it, his expression growing increasingly serious as he listened. When? He asked, echoing his question from days earlier. Are you sure? A pause. All right. Thanks for letting us know. He hung up and turned to Eleanor, who was watching him with apprehension. David's gone, he said. Checked out of the motel this morning, told the clerk he was heading back to California. Eleanor's eyes widened in disbelief. He's giving up? Just like that? Jackson shook his head. Mills doesn't think so. Says it's more likely he's regrouping, maybe calling in reinforcements. Or setting up somewhere else, watching from a distance. So we're still not safe, Eleanor said, her brief hope fading. We're safer than we were. Jackson corrected her. He's not in town anymore, which means he's not turning local opinion against us. And every day that passes gives our lawyers more time to build a case. Eleanor nodded, trying to take comfort in his words. I just want this to be over, Jackson. I want Henry to be able to go back to school, to play outside without looking over his shoulder. I want... What? Jackson prompted when she trailed off. Eleanor met his gaze directly. I want us to have a chance at a real life here. All of us. The implication hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to put words to the feelings that had been growing steadily since that first night. We will, Jackson promised, reaching across the table to take her hand. One way or another, we'll figure this out. As he spoke, he realized he truly believed it, not because he underestimated David Blackwood's determination, but because he had finally found something worth fighting for. A second chance at family, at love, at the life he'd thought forever lost on that icy road 5 years ago. Whatever came next, Jackson Harlow was no longer just existing. He was living again, fully and completely. And he would do whatever it took to protect the people who had brought him back to life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.